Tchaikovsky's Seasons is one of my favorite piano cycles, not because it's the most demonstratively difficult for the audience and for the pianists and for the juries in the competitions, because in fact it is not, but because it explores that inner world of miniatures, that narrative with a storytelling which already Schumann had found so well to define in Traumerei, in Kinderszenen, the idea to tell something with intimacy and simplicity, which depicts in a way not only the mood, but really in the case of Tchaikovsky, for each month of the season is commissioned by a magazine of the time, a different time that illustrates, in fact, or is illustrative rather, may I say, of the seasons themselves in terms of the agricultural seasons, as Russia was at that time quite agricultural country, mostly, and the different times of the year were pacing the life of the people. And Tchaikovsky, who was in fact a composer terribly strongly inspired by the Russian soul, of the human Russian soul, was able to, in these miniatures, to westernize the format while keeping the heartland of it so Russian. It's nothing to do with modal versus tonal or some kind of specific fashionable or ethnomusicological research. It is more about the fact of expressing in a few pages for each something which Satie usually can do later too, but more as a caricature of society when he imitates different sports and leisures, and he has one page for each. Here it's also the idea of the magazine, of the feuilleton in French, which would be the series, the follow-up. And of course, these pieces aren't meant to be played per se in a row, or all of them. They can be just picked and chosen and sort of seasoning the salad of a recital program, if I may use that kind of analogy, because in fact they are just so incredibly mood setting. And if you start a recital with January in this case, he calls it on the fire side. be so evocative, mostly in my inner imagination when I play them, as if I respond to some kind of ballet that I'm seeing happening in the setting of this house in the winter, and keeping it warm, but only around the fireside, and people talking to each other, small talk, possibly repeating each other because they don't hear it well. Perhaps they're old and they repeat these echo cells. But in any case, it doesn't seem to be philosophical, dramatic, or ecstatic, or some kind of exultance of the soul. I think it's beautiful to have music that can represent in a way what Satie, again, but in a further pushing it in that direction way, called musique d'ameublement, which he called furniture music. So you can hear it in the background, as he liked to think of people having the small talk on top of it. Now, to reduce Tchaikovsky's beautiful melodic, harmonic, pianistic arpeggio, phrasing, direction, line, pedaling, expression, hope, and then sometimes repetitivity, but sometimes unbelievable expectation that is coming from this almost impatience when he goes modulationing, all of a sudden modulating, rather, sorry for my English, in an unexpectedly distant key, like he did earlier in A flat major, and here he goes into B major. Major, since it's minor, by the sixth, and major by the third. And the chromatic scale that evaporates, stops into ritenuto, and going back to the simple narrative story with heartwarming, as I think, Schumannesque or Brahmsian harmonies in the sense of the miniatures, like the intermezzi of Brahms, which are more developed for some, but the point is that Schumann, I think, knew how to find that. Chopin too, naturally, when you hear a prelude and you just, or a waltz, or a mazurka. Nocturne. But not. It's aesthetically beautiful in a way that is sublime. Not that is wrong, as a matter of fact. Tchaikovsky's piano music, unlike his symphonies, his ballets, and his operas, which are so powerfully dramatic, so constructed on a large breath with such incredible sense of human soul music translation, would it be with a scope that is bigger than the frame that contains the sound image of the storytelling. I mean, you think about Romeo and Juliet. Or the second theme. Or the Sixth Symphony. In this set of pieces commissioned by this magazine of the time to print and have only one piece a month, which most likely the haute bourgeoisie of the elite that was educated and Western educated in Russia in that end of 19th century would play at home in their great dachas or their great palaces, most likely the daughters or the wives, who would be educated to play the piano and entertain their husbands through it. I mean, I know it's very cliche and very superficial and very perhaps not refined, because that was obviously not always the case. But the composers knew how to adapt to the different demands. And in this case, Tchaikovsky, who can write with such a large breadth, wrote here with intensity, but something so intimate in the sense of the expression as well as of the scope. And once he completes the ABA symmetrical, regularly expected pattern for a short piece, the return of it is, of course, into the more sort of peacefully joyful atmosphere of the beginning, but then towards the coda, echo, but third time, hemiola stretching, and then there are pages of the B section with a flat 6 in major, as if to have a deceptive cadence taste. And finish with this modal ending that is, in fact, very curious, because you could think he would have finished with opening being so narrative and singing, something elegant, which is not wrong and plausible, but he flies away. I always love that part of the fact that we cannot always guess, even if we have to complete an unfinished work. I have had the chance to do that for a Glenn Gould sonata or for Lily Boulanger theme and variations that are not fully completed for some, and for some were just partially completed. And so you have to guess, and in a way you don't want to guess, because if you guess then it's too guessable. Therefore, in a way, you want to be surprised, as all art of work creates a sense of curiosity. You always learn more about what you love first, and sometimes by learning about it you become even more inspired by what different details could mean to you. Not to make it you love it more or understand it better, sometimes it puzzles you more. That's a problem after all these decades of teaching that I can say that, but it is a fact, humbling fact. Did I really know if Tchaikovsky wanted to be played this simple opening? I consider simple, and therefore we have to define simplicity. Obviously, it's the opposite of rubato, the opposite of effects. Perhaps he didn't want to have the second time echo. Perhaps he didn't want to have a rubato from under tempo. The staccato of the perhaps quick steps on the toes of the ballerina, as I imagine it because of his ballets, and then a different tempo for the reassurance of the appoggiaturas, accacciaturas. Perhaps he didn't want rubato. In any case, if I betray him, at least it's with love. Not maliciousness or arrogance. I recall playing the Tchaikovsky's Dumka, compulsory piece for the Tchaikovsky competition, international one in Moscow. That was back in Soviet days. And Tatiana Nikolaeva was in the 18-member jury. The famous Russian pianist whom I have recordings of even before I went there, of course, she was the inspiration for Shostakovich to write his own Prelude and Fugues after the jury, where he attended her presentation as a candidate when he was in the jury of the Leipzig Bach International Competition. So he wrote her this Prelude and Fugues. Of course, she played a lot of Bach after, and she was a famous, well, not only after, all the time, like, who doesn't? But anyway, she recorded much. And she was a great figure, and she was a professor in the Russian conservatories, I mean, Soviet days. And I genuinely, perhaps naively, for sure, ill-advisedly, by teachers who let me do what I perhaps then I shouldn't have done as a late teenager, because it was my earnest opinion that all of us candidates coming from all over the world to honor Tchaikovsky's memory through this competition should bring something of our interpretational views. But I didn't think of it confrontationally, and in hindsight, as a teacher now myself, I think it was wrong. It was wrongly understood, obviously, by Tatiana Nikolaeva for this incident, because I played the ending of the last page where Tchaikovsky recalls one more time the opening theme of this very Russian peasant song that he, very model in this case, and that he displays. I imagine it will be more striking if I stroke, so to say, the chords louder and the melody in the echo of the background, like an orchestration effect. I mean, whatever the reasons or whatever the value of such, perhaps therefore betraying or creative, regardless or regarding how one looks at it. She stormed in after my recital round of the competition in the Tchaikovsky Hall in the Moscow Conservatory, and I was just back in the green room as soon as I finished playing my recital, of which this piece was a compulsory piece, and she basically screamed at me for about 2 or 3 minutes, 20 centimeters from my face. And of course I was terrified, and I was disastrously hopeful to understand what she was saying. I was guessing she was not happy. That was not difficult to guess, even if I had rudiments of Russian understanding because of my Bulgarian birth. But I didn't speak Russian, still don't. But could understand distantly because of the cousinage of the languages. Anyway, be it as it is, she was furiously upset with me, as I was told, about the fact that I desecrated Tchaikovsky's piece by such dynamic range, opposite, if you want, display to what the score says and to what the tradition says, and therefore, I guess, like conservatories conserve traditions, competitions in the name of Tchaikovsky then conserve his tradition. Therefore, tradition is supposed to be always continued and followed and reproduced. And it was really not, in that very case, an act of some rebellion of mine to be original for the sake of it, because it's never been in my musical education nor in my inner world to try to do so. I just try to earnestly express what the music talks to me about, and if it talks wrongly, then I should be told, which I desperately try to do with my own students. I respect their guessing of what it might be. I tell them stylistically what I think it should be. I give them some grounds for analytical understanding of the why, rather than just an threat of being wrong for the sake of the asymmetrical position of the teacher-student. I mean, but at some point I have to be persuasive, because for their own good, and also because I respect them. And because when you respect them, then you tell them what you think, you argue it, you give an example, Of course, nowadays, compared to my study days, you can go on internet and hear everybody's performances and compare and contrast and have your own opinion before even you've seen a teacher, let alone after a teacher tells you something different or their own truth. There isn't a single one, obviously, until the day students understand that. But there are rather guidelines that let you get to read the stylistic merging focus towards what we think the music is. So would Tchaikovsky want the first piece to be just simple in the sense without rubato, without echo? Perhaps, and how much? I think at some point as a performer, separately from the teacher, I keep a great freedom. I still do, even after the incident with Tatiana Nikolaeva. Peace to her soul, as they say. She died in concert performing in San Francisco years later after this encounter. And I was so sad. I admired her so much, even if I was obviously dramatically shocked by her reaction, which was in her own way very healthy and genuine. And I found it very beautiful in a way, in hindsight. On the dramatic moment, not so much then. But of course, that's why I was young. And that wisdom doesn't stop me from telling the storytelling of the music through my understanding of it, but also through my sensitivity and perhaps to my also as well, no matter how many years I play music and piano for some of the same pieces, I keep that freshness of the spontaneity. Of course, it's not faked spontaneity like actors who fake they die on stage every day, believably, even if it's the 3000th show of the presentation or something. Of course, you learn to do that in a way because it's part of your experience as an artist to appear astonished or appear die if you're an actor, believably so. For the audiences, so you respect each audience. And because audiences know the piece, if they do, they also don't always fake to believe that, oh my God, I'm surprised this way it ends, or I'm surprised he didn't finish in a more, as I just mentioned for the ending of the first piece, January, in a more expected way, whatever that means, other than that it ends with a flying away in a high register, rather than with a conclusion in the middle low register in which most of it was. And if it were to be so, I don't think anybody musically knowledgeable or just music lover or even professional would find it impossible, unbelievable, or unplausible. As a matter of fact, it would be probably banal. Now, composers are in the right to be banal, not to be guessed, like when I complete some of them, when I'm asked to complete some of their works, because in a way I have to guess by logic or by intuition, but their intuition won't be mine, and I cannot really substitute other than by my knowledge. And even if you do learn how to write in the style, like in Haydn, I just can make it up. It just sounds like as if, but it's not it. We know that because we know it isn't. But beyond that, I think there is a level where even if in the stylistic time frame in which music was composed, there were still freedoms that composers took outside of what we consider studying them time period by time period very carefully, that sometimes they overlap their stylistic boundaries as if, how dare they? Just to confuse our teaching? Of course not. But it's nice to notice that there are some kind of mirrorings that happen beyond the expected time frames. The second one is February, and he calls it Carnival, of course, because of Lent. And so it's obviously, when I say obviously, it's should be taken relatively. I would say then, to be more humble, I believe it is a crowd gathered to feast all together in the center of the town or the village. So that would be the music of crowd. 2x2s aren't written with staccato on the second. So if I don't do that extra characterization of the dotted eighth note by the dot of the staccato, I mean, not rhythmic. It's more like a bowing change, rather than a sort of a musical hiccup. One has to be always careful and cautious about those things. Again, as a performer, I can take the freedom because it only engages my credibility and my integrity towards serving the piece and serving it in the piece to the audience as well, while serving the piece itself. In my honesty, but it also can be changing through times. I'm not bound to the same hearing reading of the piece, but I know that if I establish the staccato, I bring it to a character issue more than the separation of 2x2 phrasing. It depends on the acoustic, the pedal, the articulation, the voicing of the quarter notes with their stems. You bring out more the moving parts or the holding parts. So many ways you can highlight it or shadow or bring out something and conceal something else according to what you want to bring in the meaning of the flow of the events, not just isolating it as I just did by repeating it, but integrating it in the flow. And so this chromatic rising of the bass line between inevitably brings a sense of excitement, of impatience, of some kind of desire to reach some high level operatic scream or laugh or crowd exaltation, which he writes with a fortissimo on the high note of the arrival point from the beginning. It's almost 16 bars until. Naturally, as a teacher, I would organize that dosage of crescendo so that it can reach its peak at the moment as expected. And I would follow this to give these guidelines to the students as if you build them tracks on which they put their own train. And then with time, they might do it differently. And sometimes they do it right away differently. And that's good. They confront you and you have to be challenged at the same time to respect them and to respect your own integrity with the reading of the piece. If not, why would you teach them other than say, it's my taste, it's my experience, I like it this way? I think it's a bit superficial. I rather explain to them the chromatic rising, the quarter notes holding, the 2x2 phrasing of the rising eighth notes by octaves, minus the staccato feel on the top, and of course acoustic pedal and all that contributes to either make it more wet or more dry, more into one direction or the other of the interpretation, which the score by itself doesn't say. There is no even pedal indication in the score. As if because of the harmonic changes, which are every quarter note, so twice a bar, they're understood they will be so. The question is that they could be also shorter by being half of the beat only. And then you have to hold with the fingers the quarter notes and separate the eighth notes so they can breathe, so to say, before the change of bow. And if the acoustics are dry, then you'll hear it more separate. And if the acoustics are resonant, though you're not responsible, I like to say to my students, for the architect of the building. After all, the acoustic is beyond your control. Not that we have much control, but at least fingers and feet when we play the piano. And then the rest is the ear, the heart, the soul, the head, the wish to organize it one way or the other. And sometimes the piano being different because it's never twice the same, the acoustics being whatever they are, our perception of the acoustics being also what they are on stage compared to the hall. So many variables which make the charm of the moment, the spur of the moment, and that's why I like to keep that when I perform, without to, of course I have ideas what I would like to construct in terms of blueprint ahead of me when I play the piece. I hear it inside. It's like you have your taste buds prepared to eat what you ordered, and then in a way it has to match your expectation of the taste of it. And if it has this ingredient too much or this ingredient too less, you'll say, oh, it's not enough this or that according to your expectation of it. In a way, the same thing. If you expect Mozart and you hear Beethoven, you can be agreeably disappointed or agreeably surprised. But if you expect to hear something that is not what comes up out of what you play, because of the instrument, the acoustic, the moment, and perhaps your own playing itself, even if you planned it one way or the other, it remains only with yourself. I mean, that's your inner world, and the audience only hears what you project. And they might even draw conclusions about why you do that. Oh, too early, too loud, or too fast, or too festive, or too sharp, or not dry enough, or too soft. And when you play four hands, you have to even share the pedals on the piano, so that all of a sudden you realize that without the coordination with the feet, you lack some of the expression, I mean the length of the sound. So all these are just so many elements that, of course, as a co-pilot who doesn't play, as a teacher, I sit next to the student and I hear the, let's say, the attempts in the lesson and the results. And that's because it's in construction mode. We can still work on these different ways of shaping the sculpture, which is still being sculpted. And then at some point you have it clear in your mind the way you want it, and most of the time the way you play it, student or teacher, in fact, I don't think it's a big difference at that level. When you perform it, it doesn't always match. And if it does, it's very rarely more than few bars. And that is usually almost besides yourself. It keeps you humble. And that's a good thing, because you apply a technique that is supposed to give you a security of the touch, and I think that some fingerings contribute to it more than others according to each individual morphology. Not all fingerings fit all. But once you find the appropriate, through the teacher or yourself, or you found the appropriate way to handle it with your fingerings for your hand, the piece, which anyway remains the same in terms of notes and values, and the keyboard is the same size regardless if you were a child or an adult now. Of course, probably feels narrower than when you were a child, when it looked it's the only instrument that doesn't come naturally with different sizes keyboards, unlike string instruments. We have quarter violins and so on. But all this put together, it's just so beautiful that the music reveals itself differently, and sometimes betrayingly, and sometimes surprisingly, and sometimes you just flow with the situation and you try to bring always the next thing ready to go, like a conductor gives an upbeat and already has imagined the piece, and the musicians perform it, like the B section of this February after finish. Minor or B minor. And then you have a dialogue, answered. I don't even have to say it, it's so obvious, and therefore when I play it, I don't want to overstate it either, because it's obvious. I could bring out the syncopation. Like sitting in front of the French horns in the orchestra. Fine, but not the picture. The picture is, after all, narratively. It's not that it's expressive, but it is perhaps small talk expressive, but it is there. And the syncopation in the harmonization of the beat is very Tchaikovsky of them. The melodies on the beat, but the harmonization is off. So this combination of Western and Eastern, because of the downbeat, which is so Russian, and the upbeat, which is so Western, traditions-wise, makes him such an incredibly Westernized international, but so incredibly Russian composer. It's for more reasons than just these, but it happens to be, I think, ingredients that can be part of the thought process, or the food for thought. So the middle section ends up with the two hands playing together the same theme, or thematic material, or motivic element, which were originally in just dialogues. I mean, I think if he was alive today, he would have probably written music for films or video games. I think he's a master of this capacity to install in few seconds the immediate right character for the storytelling, like his ballets, his operas. He can write incidental music, and in few seconds, of not even a second perhaps, whatever it is, he immediately captures musically the mood of the storytelling, of the dramatic development of what he's illustrating in music. Here he doesn't illustrate, but he uses the same style of fragmented, clearly depicting. It's almost like dollhouse size, but everything is inside. It's not the grand breadth of the operas and symphonies, but still, when you finish this A section and you go back to an C section, the stesso tempo, the same tempo, of his is to his credit. Of course, it's his choice. If he had made shorter, I would have said how marvelous that is brief. And if he develops it further than the miniature that it is, I would say how marvelous that he does. Of course, we are, by the fact that we have it and love it, we are musicians as we are knowledgeable as we become. We come to accept, to expect, and therefore to like what we discover. In a way, we recite it, we don't make it up. He did. And the idea of developing it further for a miniature than an ABA, but meaning an ABA-CA, proves that he was really, what I like to hear, generous in the sense of he doesn't just do as little as needed or as possible with his grand inspiration, like a melody and accompaniment, that's it. It could be enough for this monthly magazine after all, but he's like Bach writing cantatas weekly, like Haydn writing symphonies almost weekly too. He's all these composers who, instead of industrializing, of course, they remain incredibly, it's like they don't multiply the ease, facility. They search to challenge themselves in subtleties, as a true craftsman would do, loving their job, their work, their calling, whatever you want, but the honor, the pleasure of doing it well and going beyond just the minimum. And sometimes the minimum is what they think is necessary, and then it's beautiful when it's short. But here I find that for the performer, we have to find ways to not defend it because it's not accused, of course, not having to justify it as if we are saving it, because that would be, of course, presumptuous. It's more about being intrigued. Oh, why does he go so further into this? And then realize that for his return to the opening section, he uses the elements of the B and the C superimposed. Okay, it's not a Bach fugue in 6 voices, so I cannot say, oh, it's the complexity of the layering that makes it so special. I think it's just that even if the inspiration is willingly popular in the sense of peasants gathering perhaps at the square of their village in February to break fasting and enjoying the carnival, and but then it becomes I find that so humbling, to find that great composers take care of being generous in details and in subtleties, ambiguities, ambivalences. Up to us as performers to find a way to translate it, to bring it to the audience with our earnest understanding, not overstating, not understating, just trying to find the right tone that will be not only convincing but conveying for what we want it to convey, even if we can change mind with time or even whenever. But while we do it with this conviction that we bring it to you, like in March, he writes the Song of the Nightingale. Daydreaming, I wouldn't be offensive to define why it's beautiful: syncopation, melodic line, dialogue, capacity to have secondary voices that come in all of a sudden to enrich the material, which by itself is beautiful because of the melodic line's beauty, which doesn't need a secondary voice, but all of a sudden he decides to enrich the texture here and not there and not everywhere and not nowhere, and so we just accept the beauty instead of trying to make sense of it. Let's define why it's beautiful, and we can put the ingredients and then say because of these ingredients it's beautiful. It's in G minor, it's an ostinato, G-stinato, sol-stinato. And there is a G minor piece in a similar mood. Tier by Mussorgsky for piano. So if I didn't say that, you would say, oh, it sounds like another Tchaikovsky piece of the Seasons if you don't know the piece. Because it's in the Kuzinich, in the same mood, it's the same time period. You know, it's always the case when we play music, most of the time, out of the context of the time, so we start comparing it to other things. We try to put it chronologically in the flow of the stylistic evolution, which considered by us as evolution, at least timeline, let's put it this way. And then the famous are great and the less famous are imitative of the great. But in fact, they all bathed in the same musical pond. And I think that if we played only music then, there, where it was written and where it was heard and where it was part of the ecosystem, would it be Baroque Italy or would it be Romantic era Russia? So we will find in that beautiful ecosystem so many composers, some French conservatoire, ill calling the lesser known les petits maîtres, the small masters, which is so not in fact humble, not to mention arrogant, but it's a way to put some kind of a layering of importance, as if we are so important that we have to define who they are, who's more important among them. In fact, therefore, who's more played, who's more taught, who's more performed, who's more recorded, who's more considered, and therefore all of a sudden you have the Brahms, Chopin, and all these famous, and then the others, they're small masters. But I still think that this will match later the barcarolle of the Tchaikovsky Seasons. Of course, it's not comparable, but it is from the same DNA. And I think that once we are out of it, we look at it either museum style, either we search for it, like we're going to re-establish that stylistic understanding. The instruments are not the same, the ears, the psychology is not the same. I mean, these people composed this when there was no running water, no electricity, no real heating, and the light of the day ended and the night came, and it was part of it. We have electricity that with the lights kills the night in terms of productivity and work. Everything changes in the psyche of people, regardless of how intellectual they are or how imaginative they are and how ahead of their time they are when they write to each other or they write novels or poems. And of course, not all of them do, but those who did and whom we read, we're astonished. How did they build the pyramids? How did they build the Acropolis? How? But in fact, they had to. Like the cathedrals or all these things without technology that were done and that last. And you think if an architecture is this, but then the understanding of the human soul in ancient Greek theater, in the philosophers from Greece, and of course everything that we consider universal in the human experience. And then, of course, when we play this late 19th century set of short pieces, inevitably, if it reminds us of another one, of a lesser known, it immediately becomes like, oh, who stole it? But it doesn't matter because probably nobody did. And in this case, it's not even a matter of stealing or borrowing or copyright or lack of copyright, at that time period at least. I think it was just a question of the different kind of musical styles and genres and expressions that were suitable to the listeners of their time and that were provided by the musicians of their time. Given the fact some Beethoven comes in the early Viennese school of Haydn and Mozart and breaks some of the codes to further say what he has to say because he doesn't satisfy himself with what he received in terms of the tools of the language. But others, no. Schubert didn't, Mozart didn't. Debussy did, but Ravel didn't. And it doesn't make them lesser or greater or more important or more revolutionary or more avant-garde or more traditional, like Brahms, compared to, let's say, Debussy. In the same late years of Brahms, young Debussy was already composing things that you would say is further thinking. But I don't think it was only, or if ever, even if they were, in provocation or in desire to rupture with something like Schoenberg did intellectually with the dodecaphonism. Or these things happen regardless of the reasons. And when you hear music that is composed in its own time period and performed and heard then, and perhaps even perceived differently than today, when you teach, I try to bring the student to the realm of understanding how was it heard then, what did people read about then, what did people watch then in terms of paintings or in terms of sculpture, what did people dream of in terms of social advancement of things, who was playing these pieces, why the daughters of the bourgeois family were playing the piano, who built the pianos to bring them in the salons, how did it become that the harpsichord became the piano. There are industry elements into the story, as well as artistic reasons, as well as development of salons and concert halls before they even became these huge airport size lounges where we play big concert hall performances, and how chamber music was truly so what it meant, chamber music, with people just around listening to it. Would it be music lovers most of the time, or patrons, not audiences are aligned by rows. But that is the case today, and we still have to transmit for them what the music of the time that was not meant for this kind of presentation, with the instrument, the hall, the expectation, the recordings, the digitalization of it all. Of course, it's like out of its own time frame. Perhaps it becomes even more universal because it's no more related only to its time frame. It's not just only informed interpretation with the understanding of the tradition of the time through our studies about it, the treatises, what we know about how people played this and that. It's valuable, but we don't just play for a museum reenacting. I think we play for the present that is now, the now that is perhaps the then for them, but was there now, and now is our now. And I don't think ever as a performer, a teacher, or even a music thinker, a composer myself, that I compose for another time period. I just compose when I am alive, and therefore it's now, and I am happy to be now. I have no choice really. But on the other hand, I can enjoy with the capacity now that technology gives us even more to know more with curiosity about the music of the past. Try to understand the music of today in its plurality. Well, not always, but try. It's difficult. It's plethoric. It's confusing. Easy to reject. Or easy to embrace on the surface. Rather accept it when you can filter it in depth and understand what you think the value of it is. And then you can become a truly believable performer or teacher, instead of just repeating what you were told and transmitting a tradition you were taught. Because in a way, even if it was right then, it doesn't mean that when you learned it from your teachers, that's the way your students should be playing it, just because you're the passing link. Yes, for some things, fingerings, phrasing, tastes, ideas, but you develop your own after you have studied, or even during the studies. So it's not like just, again, the conservatory of knowledge that has to be transmitted intactly, or the least possibly changed. I think everything changes constantly. The expression in the music of the feelings of humanity about yearning, hoping, loving, dying, parting more than dying, all these things that in fact live with us since we are born. And we don't thankfully think of the ticking bomb that it is until it happens. Or timer rather than bomb, perhaps. It's a more suitable analogy. But if we think about it, it's relatively stressful. and distressing, to say the least. I can speak myself, but all of us can speak yourselves about that. And some artists transcended their own humanity of the day by giving us something that is a Mona Lisa or Guernica by Picasso, and in this case in a smaller scale, but with the same intimate tenderness and sense of depth of truth, more than posturing about style, attitude, and virtuosity for the sake of it, which is nice too when we need it, because we need all of that. We don't need only philosophy or only superficiality or only this or only that. We need a little of all of that, because we are done of all of this in terms of our psychological construction and as humans. And I think that the music can translate at the different levels the suitable and subtle layering of these different perceptions of what the world is, and to us while we are around it, and how we reflect it. Some people were here before me playing it, and there'll be others here playing it after me. And I'm just now, I am sharing it with you because I want to share with you the meanings of the inspiration. And I rather do it with more playing and less speaking, so I will try to be true to this from April onwards, since we are now in the Personnage is the early first flower that comes in spring, lily. The budding of the spring, the flow, perhaps the wind, and then the melody trying to stay, perhaps the flowers trying to stay while they're just very, very, very fragile and young. Who knows? It's my idea, but it doesn't matter what my idea is I'm nothing, the piece is everything. And the piece reveals itself differently every time, which is so rewarding, because then it's a gift that keeps on giving rather than repeating yourself. No certitudes. No certitudes. In May we have the the starlit night. Can one not see the daydreaming, wandering when you look at the stars at night in the spring or early summer? You feel part of the cosmos. You feel like bedazzled by everything. The middle section, which is allegro giocoso compared to the andantino in the beginning, is perhaps some of that kind of excitement. So many things are said, so many things are hinted, so many things are... It's like the left hand is impatient and the right hand wants to tell all what it feels, sees, hears, or reflects. It's just incredible. I don't know that in so little can so much be said. We think is miniatures. Probably to us today it's very long and developed. Probably in the 19th century when they were Russian, in Russia I mean, they are yearning for more art, more music, they didn't have this overwhelming amount of electronic music being pumped everywhere. So perhaps the miniatures today would be shorter. Perhaps you can make the same by saying, and say that's it. And then you switch to the next, like commercials and like shorts on the audiovisual screens today. Be it. Be it. I still think is important to take in account the fact of the repetitivity, even in this short for the time forms. And they have some kind of terms of endearment or an expression of intensification or perhaps distanciation, or perhaps just for the listener or the reader, therefore the performer, perhaps the sight reader of the magazine's monthly, oh, what did Tchaikovsky write this month? Excitement to read something you like to follow, like when you watch a television series or something you want to see what the writers came up with. So like you read War and Peace or some long book and you leave it to do other things, you go back to it and you follow up and you become addicted in a way, in a good way. Of course there is no bad way, but sometimes dangerous way. But artistically to a given style, genre, and you like to know if what happens now and how would it develop and what happens to the plot and what happened to this and how will it develop. Sometimes the performer has to be also the narrator, not only the recitant. But that is the subtle combination of the two to be taken in account. In June is the barcarolle. Say that most of the barcarolles are in 12/8 or 6/8 to be representing the flow, like in Chopin, of the boat, Venetian style, the gondolas. And here his barcarolle in Tchaikovsky is in 4/4, relatively square with downbeatishness. But that's the license of the artist. Who are we to tell him, oh, Tchaikovsky, you should know? Of course he knew. You should have done. I'm very happy that nobody told him that. And even if they did, probably he wouldn't have cared. So perhaps he called it barcarolle, but in 4/4. I think in the performance it can have a little bit in the melodic line design and gestural tossing, a little bit of rubato that can break the evenness of the 4/4 compared to the short long beats in the 3/4, 6/8, 12/8, whichever. Not to fake that we miss that, it's not, but to give it a little bit of supple perhaps one shouldn't. Perhaps the hint is in this exaggeration already. say that evocative, it's more than decorative. It's evocative is more powerful in many ways than just imitational or program music, as we call it, versus pure music, whatever that means. Well, we know what it means, but nevertheless, even if there are titles, like Debussy wrote in his preludes the titles at the end to avoid the pianist to be too much under the locked imagination of the title. Not to belittle the music that can evoke so much more than only what it's supposed to depict. And it does, just like literature does and all arts do. The chosen word that hints, an innuendo that highlights the moment of sadness with some kind of smile. Victor Hugo said very well that nostalgia is the happiness of the sad people. And this capacity of duality of the human being should be nurtured, not locked in the expectations that we're supposed to just have this music as a reflection of what it's supposed to depict. Well, it does, but it doesn't only. And that's the beauty of it. And in whatever it is that is not only, it's in the eye of the beholder, the ear of the beholder. And it doesn't have to be that explained, in fact. This is in July, the Song of the Reaper. I think he takes pleasure in giving us quality A prime sections from all those ABAs, most of them being ABAs, not all. And this return, always with a little difference, is just so beautifully subtle and at the same time creative. And you could say, but not per se only, polyphonic. The Song of the Harvest is couldn't be more driven. Using the hemiola ta 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 compared to the 6/8 ta ta ti da, long short ta ta long short, and then long 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 short short. Gives that energy of the flow of things that are not just always the same flow. He does instead ta ti tam ta tam ta ta, and I find that very beautiful because in a way it's not the biggest contrast in the world, but it's just enough of that little intention that keeps us as listeners on our toes, and performers not to mention. accelerando effect. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, and then I think Schumann was not far in his ideas, which he does in the concerto of the last movement. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And I think here I can see here, imagine, not that he needed to have Schumann as an example, but he uses this device of the hemiole in his own way, but it really pulls the energy off the ground. Hemiole line now with the 3/4, I mean 3/4, 3/4, the 3/4 a beat compared to the left hand in 6/8. Most people would have done a deceptive cadence. He does plagal, but that's still very exciting. In the relative major of the calm and singing and almost static moment to be the welcome, of course. Contrast is a B section to the opening, but he doesn't write under tempo. So if you played the repeated notes, it just sound easily, but play the sounds more on the piano percussive. If he had written but no, of course, and he shouldn't have, but I have to make it melodic and repeated and in tempo and calm. Outside of the box, not as a teacher, just as a musician, that this could be a little bit on the meno mosso side. It wouldn't hurt, betray, or anything. But it is true that on the written score, in the published edition, there is no such a thing, and therefore when the return of the A prime comes, you have to catch up the tempo and show that you are, in fact, demonstrate how much you lost the tempo. Those things can be negotiated with one's consciousness or with one's virtuosity or with one's experience, and see how the tectonic plates could be closer than just to dropped, or yeah. But in any case, it remains a very, very, very driven, exciting piece. So is September with the Hunter Song. Natural horn sounds of the hunting. Very, very brassy, I think. would be the famous scherzo of the Sixth Symphony. This kind of dotted rhythm, Schumannian, like in the Carnival. No, in the Fantasy slow second movement when he goes. This kind of festive moment with dotted rhythms, and here. Trumpets, horns, and tutti. And then he goes in every possible secondary dominant that he can think of. And finish definedly militaristic, so to say. B section. With his dialogues and his sequences. Okay, he's readable, but not guessable. Not totally. It's not supposed to be 1812 overture, but it has in so many aspects reflections of it in his piano writing as well. I really am interested to know how the people who discovered it in September of the given 19th century ending year in their monthly magazine put it on the piano and read that. Must have been challenging even then. Probably they had better technique. But in any case, it's the beauty of the novelty then, and I think freshly today too. If you remain in that intemporality of the freshness of the spontaneity. I believe in it very much. October is the autumn song. Dialogue romance. And I must say that this is a moment to express thankfulness to Tchaikovsky for writing something predictable in the circle of fifths. It doesn't sound popish, and it doesn't sound cheap. So it's not the complexity of the difference of the language that the only difference that differs in the way the composer, the artist, the human expresses himself. Sometimes they express themselves the most truly with the most banal harmonic progression, but it has its merits. It's such a beautiful one. Thankfully, he didn't tell himself as a composer, no, that's been done too much. Thankfully for us. Of the melodic line with the syncopations allows to catch up the tempo when at the same time the downbeatishness feeling settles you in the mood that it's supposed to be. So it's a little bit of the two, and I find it fascinating how he gives us as a performer the opportunity to establish the downbeat or to be ahead of it, and to find that way to bridge through the beats and express oneself with a narrative freedom of speech, of the pacing of it, and then the triplets, then the eighth notes before, and differently harmonizing the A in D minor or in D major as a dominant seventh. And all that doesn't suffice to explain anything other than observe what you love. Also chromatic symphonic syncopations, and then a melodic line with a secondary voice and a circle of fifths, harmonic progression, and all that quoted in a very melody minor romance, that it will become such an incredibly distinguished music and not some banal recoup of the already heard music before him, or us, or then, or them. I think we should remain very humble in front of this fact. Because if not, it's like the parent who brings their child to a Picasso painting exhibit saying, oh, my child can also do this. Yes, but no. It's reassuring that Picasso can draw like my child. I find that fantastic. The troika in November is the winter sled with the 3 horses. Troika, that's 3 in Russian. And he uses the little sound of the bells that you put for decoration and to announce your arrival on the silent snow gliding around. And you can hear that in his middle section when he uses the grace note for that. In the opening, you feel the galloping of the horses. The mood is jolly, there's no question about it. evocative, it's really depicting. And the way he has to use, he uses this galloping musical explanation of the horses pulling the sled in the snow, is when he goes to the A prime, this time with the sound of the bells of the on the tip of the heads of the horses. Sorry, it was a C sharp. My eyes saw a second ledger line that doesn't exist. If only they wrote the ledger lines in treble clef, it would help so much. But they didn't do that then, and so we have to make sure. I shouldn't make that mistake, and I got caught in that. Even if they appear easy. Of course, nothing is ever easy, let less such clear writing doesn't leave room for approximation, let less for a misread ledger line. Mademoiselle Boulanger must be so upset. Eh oui, but that's sometimes only human. Nevertheless, I was taught to be unforgiving for myself and by her, and tolerant with the others, so not going to invert that for convenience. The month of December is in the tempo of a waltz, and he really represents himself in a ballroom, very Western style for Russia. It's no more these modal ways or these peasant ways or these specific Russian ways of the troika, which existed mostly only there. So it's almost like a waltz that is based on something that you could dance in a Western style court as theirs tried to imitate, but in some aspects. It's almost like as if the Western European tradition seen from the Eastern point of view, but trying to blend both of the inner ear music. It's not imitation, it's more appropriation, it's more fusion. I'll have to part with you today after this waltz. Elegant as a Chopin at least idealized or daydreamed as he saw it, as they thought of it. Trying to be elegant, being elegant, imitating or just daydreaming or just transposing by thoughts. Perhaps idealizing the reality of what they were trying to imitate. But it's a beautiful idea that a composer like him can very humbly take this assignment and write a month a piece that, of course, they're not meant to be played, but together, but they're meant to be, I think, cherished, and that's certainly what I shared with you today. I thank you so much for having shared that with me.